You want to hear a crazy story? I'm willing to bet I hold the world record for the most HOA violations rectified in a single afternoon. We're talking about 139 of them, gone. Poof. So drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. And settle in. Because this one involves my family's legacy. A lake that wasn't supposed to exist. An HOA president who thought she was a queen. And the simple, undeniable power of gravity. It all started when the Lakeview Pinnacle Estates Homeowners Association decided to build a vacation village on my property. They thought my lake was their biggest asset. They were wrong. It was their biggest liability, because they forgot to ask the one question that mattered. Who controls the water? Spoiler alert, I do. And when they pushed me too far, I just let it go. My family has owned this land for 5 generations. Not the ritzy new money kind of ownership, but the hard scrabbled dirt under the fingernails kind. My great-great-grandfather, Angus MacLeod, bought over 2,000 acres of what was then considered undesirable Appalachian hill country. It was rocky, steep, and nobody wanted it for farming. But Angus was a civil engineer, and he saw something nobody else did: water. Specifically, a narrow gorge on our property where 3 large creeks converged. In the 1920s, with his own hands, his own money, and a crew of local guys, he built a dam. Not a massive Hoover-style concrete behemoth, but a very respectable, over-engineered cyclopean masonry dam. He used the stone from the land itself, and it created a 700-acre lake where there was once just a muddy valley. He called it Loch MacLeod. He built a small stone and timber lodge on a high promontory overlooking his creation, and that's where I live today. The dam wasn't just for a pretty view. It was a feat of engineering designed for flood control and, theoretically, hydroelectric power, though he never got around to installing the turbines. For generations, my family were the quiet custodians of this land and this lake. We paid our taxes, maintained the dam, and enjoyed the solitude. The deed, and, more importantly, the riparian rights, were ironclad. The dam, the lakebed, and the water itself belonged to the MacLeod Trust, my trust. Fast forward to about 3 years ago. The world discovered our quiet little corner of the mountains. A developer bought a 1,000-acre parcel of land adjacent to ours, a plot we had sold off back in the 70s to cover some estate taxes. The developer, a slick company called Pinnacle Living, carved it up into a high-end gated community, Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. I didn't have a problem with it at first. People have a right to live where they want. I was just the quiet guy up the hill in the old stone house. But then came Karen. That wasn't her real name, of course. Her name was Brenda McLaughlin, but she was a Karen in the most profound, elemental sense of the word. She was the inaugural HOA president. A woman in her late 50s who drove a white-on-white Escalade and wore expensive resort wear as if she were perpetually on a veranda in Palm Beach instead of the Appalachian foothills. She had the kind of brittle, sun-damaged smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she looked at our ancestral land not as a place of history and quiet beauty, but as an amenity to be monetized. Brenda saw my lake, Loch MacLeod, as the crown jewel of her new kingdom. It was right there in the name, wasn't it? Lakeview Estates. She started treating it as if it were hers. First came the passive-aggressive newsletters. We remind all residents to enjoy the beautiful community lake responsibly. Then came the direct emails, addressed to me. The HOA board has noticed your personal dock is in need of aesthetic updating. Please see attached bylaws for approved color palettes. I politely replied that the HOA's authority ended precisely at my well-marked property line and that my dock's aesthetic was my business. This was like a gauntlet thrown down. Brenda's entire persona was predicated on unquestioned authority. The idea that a scruffy-looking man in his 40s, living in an old stone pile, her words, overheard at the local market, could defy her, was simply not acceptable. She saw a bachelor who inherited some land. She didn't see a man who also happened to be a hydrological engineer who had spent his entire life studying, maintaining, and understanding the very dam that gave her a lake view. She consistently, fatally underestimated me. That was her first mistake. Her second was much, much bigger. It involved 139 cabins, a fraudulent survey, and a complete and utter disregard for the law, both man-made and natural. It was a mistake that would ultimately require me to teach her a very expensive, very wet lesson in property rights. The escalation began, as it often does, with a simple fence. I had the entire 2,000-acre parcel properly surveyed and marked every few hundred feet with discreet but official iron pins and bright orange flags, especially along the border with Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. I wasn't being aggressive. I was being precise. I believe in good fences, making good neighbors. Brenda, however, seemed to believe that good neighbors were ones who ceded their property for her convenience. Her first major move was to announce the Lakeview Community Recreation Area. It was a beautifully rendered map in their monthly newsletter, showing a sandy beach, a fishing pier, a volleyball court, and a kayak launch. It was a lovely plan. It was also entirely on my land. I sent her a cease and desist letter via my lawyer, a calm, firm document that pointed out the very clear property lines on the county plat map and included a copy of my recent survey. Her response was dismissive. She claimed there was a discrepancy in the surveys and that the HOA was relying on their own, more recent plat map. This was the first I'd heard of it. I went down to the county records office, and there it was, a newly filed survey map for Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. It was a masterpiece of subtle forgery. The surveyor, a name I didn't recognize, had ever so slightly shifted the boundary line, jogging it out a few hundred feet along the entire length of the lake. It was just enough to absorb about 50 acres of my prime shoreline, including the gentle cove where they planned their recreation area. The document looked official. It had a seal. But I knew it was wrong. My family's deeds went back a century. So, I did what I do best. I dug. I'm an engineer. I live for data. I pulled the original 1920s deeds, the 1970s sale documents, and my own recent survey. I then spent a weekend with my GPS rover, a high-precision surveying tool, and reshot every single boundary marker myself. The result was a point cloud of data that proved, with centimeter-level accuracy, that the HOA's map was a fiction. The real kicker? I looked up the surveyor listed on their plat. The man had lost his license 2 years prior for falsifying documents in a commercial zoning case. He was legally barred from submitting any plans at all. This was my smoking gun. I compiled everything into a neat, damning report and sent it to Brenda and the entire HOA board, again via my lawyer. I thought, naively, that this irrefutable proof of fraud would be the end of it. I expected a sheepish apology, a retraction. I underestimated her ego. Brenda's response was to double down. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended as a concerned and amused observer, she held up my report and called it a campaign of harassment by a disgruntled local. She waved her fraudulent map and declared, "This is our community. This is our lake. We will not be bullied." The assembled homeowners, most of whom just wanted a nice place to live and were caught in her gravity, applauded dutifully. Her enablers on the board, a collection of yes-men who were clearly intoxicated by their proximity to power, nodded in solemn agreement. They voted to proceed with the construction of the recreation area immediately, and they did. The bulldozers arrived the following Monday. I filmed them from my porch as they crossed my property line, tearing up the earth, felling 100-year-old oak trees. I called the sheriff. When the deputy arrived, he was met by Brenda and the HOA's slick lawyer. They showed him their fraudulent map. I showed him my authentic survey. The deputy, a young guy just trying to do his job, was caught in the middle. He looked from one map to the other and said, "Sir, ma'am, this is a civil dispute. It's a property line disagreement. You'll have to take it to court," which is exactly what Brenda was counting on. She knew litigation could take years and cost a fortune. She was betting I didn't have the stomach or the resources to fight her corporate-backed machine. She was wrong again. I filed for an immediate injunction, but as she had planned, the court docket was backed up. The soonest we could get a hearing was 6 months away. In Brenda's mind, Possession was 10/10 of the law. She saw a 6-month window, and in that window, she didn't just build a beach. She went for the gold. She announced Phase 2, the Pinnacle Cabins, an exclusive collection of rustic luxury waterfront vacation rentals. 139 of them, to be exact, clustered along the very shoreline she had just stolen. These weren't just little shacks. They were prefabricated, high-end units with plumbing, electricity, and HVAC, set on concrete slab foundations. Her gamble was that by the time we got to court, the cabins would be a fait accompli, and no judge would order the demolition of a multi-million-dollar development. It was a brazen, shocking escalation. It was also the beginning of the end for her, because while she was focused on bulldozers and concrete, I was focused on history, on water, and on the fine print of a deed signed almost 100 years ago. She was building on the shore of Loch McLeod. She had forgotten that the loch answered to me. The construction was a whirlwind of noise, dust, and arrogance. Every morning, I'd watch the fleet of trucks rumble past the turnoff to my lodge, kicking up clouds of dirt. They worked with incredible speed, a testament to what you can accomplish when you ignore trivial things like permits, environmental impact studies, and property rights. The 139 cabins sprouted like ugly, rectangular mushrooms along my shoreline. They were packed in tight, each with a tiny deck facing the water, a parody of the spacious nature they were meant to celebrate. Brenda was a constant presence on site, pointing and directing from the seat of a golf cart, a queen surveying the expansion of her empire. She would sometimes drive up to the edge of the construction zone nearest my house, stop, and just stare up at my lodge, a smug little smile on her face. It was a silent, daily taunt. "See? I'm winning!" her posture screamed. "What are you going to do about it, Mr. McLeod?" What I was doing was spending my days in my great-grandfather's study and my nights in the pump house at the base of the dam. The study was a treasure trove. Angus MacLeod was a meticulous record keeper. I found his original engineering blueprints for the dam, his hand-penned calculations on flow rates, spillway capacity, and structural integrity. But the most important discovery was his journal. Tucked into a passage from 1928, I found what I was looking for. He wrote, "The lake reaches its fullest extent at an elevation of 845 feet above sea level. This is the natural high water mark, dictated by the topography of the valley. For safety and recreational use, I have engineered the primary sluice gates to maintain the water level at a constant 838 feet. However, the integrity of the structure and the spillway is designed to easily withstand the full 845-foot level in the event of a generational flood. 7 feet. That was the magic number. 7 vertical feet of elevation difference between the lake's current, artificially maintained level and its true, natural shoreline. 7 feet that Angus had engineered as a safety buffer. 7 feet of pure, liquid justice. I pulled out my topographical maps and my survey data and started plotting. My own land, including my lodge, was well above the 850-foot contour line. But the 50 acres Brenda had stolen, the land where her 139 cabins were being hastily erected, it was a gentle, beautiful slope. The lowest cabin foundations were sitting at 839 feet. The highest were just shy of 844 feet. They were all nestled comfortably within my 7-foot buffer. They were all, technically, in the lake bed. My next step was the dam itself. I had maintained it my whole life, as my father had before me. The mechanics were beautifully simple, a testament to 1920s engineering. The primary controls for the 2 main sluice gates were a pair of massive 36-inch cast-iron wheel valves located in the dry gallery, a concrete tunnel running through the heart of the dam. They were manually operated. Turning those wheels was a workout. It took hundreds of rotations to fully open or close the gates, a deliberate design to prevent accidental or sudden changes in water level. It was slow, ponderous, and unstoppable. I spent a week down there, inspecting every gear, greasing every fitting, checking the seals. Everything was in perfect working order, a silent, powerful machine waiting for a command. While the HOA was busy pouring concrete, I was preparing my case. I wasn't just relying on my inherited power. I documented everything. I set up time-lapse cameras overlooking the construction site. I flew a drone over the area weekly, taking high-resolution aerial photographs that clearly showed the cabins being built well below the 845-foot contour line, which I had marked on the images. I contacted the state's Department of Environmental Quality, sending them a report with photos showing the lack of silt fences, the clear-cutting of the riparian buffer zone, and the potential for septic runoff from 139 new cabins built without proper permits. They sent Brenda a notice of violation, which she promptly ignored. She felt invincible. Her lawyers were fighting my injunction in court, burying my attorney in paperwork, delaying and obfuscating. She believed the system would protect her. She failed to understand that I had access to a system far older and more powerful than the county court. The final piece of the puzzle was legal. I needed to be absolutely certain that my actions would be defensible. My lawyer, a shrewd old country attorney named Sam, was initially aghast at my plan. "You want to do what?" he asked, peering at me over his spectacles. But then, I laid it all out. The deeds, the riparian rights documents establishing my ownership of the lakebed up to the natural high water mark, Angus's journal, the topographical survey data. My right to control the water level for the purpose of maintaining the dam and ensuring its safety was explicitly written into the original deed. We drafted a final, formal letter. It was a masterpiece of legal prose. It informed the Lakeview Pinnacle Estates HOA that they had illegally constructed 139 structures on my private property, specifically within the designated flood easement of the Loch McLeod Dam. It stated that for urgent and necessary structural inspections and maintenance, as recommended by a hydrological engineer, me, the lake would need to be temporarily returned to its documented natural maximum elevation of 845 feet. It gave them a deadline, 48 hours to evacuate any personnel and remove any property from the clearly demarcated easement zone. We sent it via certified mail, with a signature required. I knew Brenda would sign for it. I pictured her reading it, scoffing and tossing it into the trash, another piece of harassment from the man up the hill. And that's exactly what she did. The day after the letter was delivered, they started moving in furniture. The morning of the deadline was calm and overcast. A gentle mist hung over the lake, muffling the sounds of the construction crew as they put the finishing touches on the cabins. They were installing curtains and stacking firewood on the tiny porches. It had a surreal, almost theatrical quality. They were literally dressing the set for a disaster movie. My 48-hour notice had been ignored, just as I knew it would be. I received no calls, no emails, just the arrogant silence of people who believe rules don't apply to them. At 9:00 a.m., the exact moment the deadline expired, I drove my truck down to the dam. I had a thermos of coffee, a portable speaker playing some classic rock, and a sense of grim, methodical purpose. Before I started, I made 2 calls. The first was to the sheriff's office. I informed the dispatcher that as the owner and operator of the Loch McLeod Dam, I was commencing a standard, non-emergency maintenance procedure that would involve slowly raising the water level to the documented high water mark of 845 feet over the next 12 to 24 hours. I told them all adjacent property owners had been notified in writing. The dispatcher was a bit confused, but made a note of it. My second call was to Sam, my lawyer. "It's time," I said. "Godspeed," he replied. "I've got the injunction paperwork ready to file Monday morning," citing their failure to vacate the easement as proof of immediate and irreparable harm. But I knew we wouldn't need it. Then I went to work. I entered the cool, echoing concrete gallery of the dam. The air smelled of damp stone and old machinery. I walked to the first massive wheel valve, the one controlling the primary north gate. I put my hands on the cold iron, took a deep breath, and began to turn. It was stiff at first, resisting decades of static peace. Then, With a groan of metal and a shudder that I felt through the soles of my boots, it started to move. The gearing system whined to life, a low, powerful sound that vibrated through the structure. A small indicator needle on the wall began to creep from closed toward open. Outside, deep beneath the surface of the lake, a multi-ton steel gate was slowly, inch by inch, beginning to slide upward, reducing the outflow of the creeks that fed the lock. I turned and turned and turned. It was exhausting work. Each rotation was a physical effort. I switched to the second wheel, for the south gate, and repeated the process. For the next 3 hours, I moved between the two wheels, steadily cranking them open, following the operational sequence outlined in my great-grandfather's notes. I wasn't just dumping the lake. I was curtailing its exit. The dam wasn't failing. It was functioning perfectly, precisely as it had been designed to. It was simply obeying a new command. The 3 creeks that fed Loch McLeod now poured more water in than the partially closed gates were letting out. The lake began to rise. It was almost imperceptible at first. An inch, then another. If you weren't watching for it, you wouldn't notice. But I was watching. I left the gallery and went to my favorite vantage point, the promontory near my lodge. I had a pair of powerful binoculars and a spotting scope. Around noon, I saw the first sign. The water, which normally lapped a good 20 feet away from the lowest row of cabins, was now gently touching the edge of the new, hastily laid turf. By 1:00 p.m., the water was covering their tiny front yards. The construction crew, returning from their lunch break, were the first to notice. I saw a group of them standing and pointing. One man walked to the edge of the water, then looked back at his foreman, shrugging. They probably assumed it was a natural fluctuation. An hour later, they were no longer shrugging. The water was now licking at the concrete slabs of the first tier of cabins. I could see the foreman on his phone, gesticulating wildly. Panic is a contagion. It started with the crew, then spread as a couple of HOA board members, who had come to inspect the new furniture, arrived on the scene. I watched through my binoculars as Brenda's white Escalade pulled up. She got out, hands on her hips, her body language radiating pure fury. She clearly thought this was some trick, some temporary plumbing issue. She marched toward the water's edge, her expensive sandals sinking into the now sodden ground. The water was visibly rising now, creeping up the sides of the foundations. It wasn't a wave. It was a slow, inexorable tide. Her shouting was too far away for me to hear, but I could imagine it. It was the sound of someone whose entire world, built on bluff and bluster, was dissolving in front of her. By 4:00 p.m., the lowest cabins were islands. The water was halfway up their doors. Electrical systems were shorting out. I saw a few porch lights flicker and die. Pallets of unused building materials floated away like tiny barges. The sight was biblical. Nature wasn't raging. It was just calmly, quietly reclaiming its own. This wasn't a flood. It was an eviction. And the water kept rising. Higher and higher it climbed, claiming cabin after cabin, a silent, liquid tide of consequence. The fallout was spectacular, and it unfolded exactly as I knew it would. By evening, the water level had risen by nearly 5 feet. It swamped the first 4 rows of cabins completely, filling them with murky lake water, ruining drywall, flooring, and the brand-new furniture. The highest cabins had water halfway up their walls. The entire Pinnacle Cabins development, Brenda's multi-million-dollar monument to her own hubris, was a waterlogged disaster zone. My phone started ringing just after the sheriff's deputy, the same one from the property line dispute, showed up at the end of my driveway. He was joined by a frantic, sputtering Brenda. "He's flooding us out! He's destroying our property! Arrest him!" she was screeching, pointing a trembling finger up toward my lodge. The deputy walked up to my porch, looking tired. "Sir," he said, "Miss McLaughlin here is making some pretty serious accusations." I just smiled calmly, handed him a cold bottle of water, and gave him the full tour. I showed him the certified mail receipt for the notice we had sent. I showed him my great-grandfather's blueprints, the deed specifying my riparian rights, and the section of the operational manual detailing the procedure for raising the lake to the 845-foot high water mark for maintenance. I explained that I was the dam's legal operator and was performing a long overdue structural integrity test, a procedure for which I had a professional obligation as an engineer and a legal right as the owner. I pointed down at the submerged cabins. "Deputy," I said, "as far as I'm concerned, all I see is an unauthorized debris field that someone illegally dumped in my lake's flood easement. I gave them 48 hours' notice to remove it. They chose not to." He looked at my meticulous documentation, then down at the shrieking mess Brenda had become, and the truth began to dawn on him. He wasn't looking at a crime scene, he was looking at a self-inflicted wound. He walked back down and told her, once again, that this was a civil matter. The look on her face, illuminated by the flashing lights of his cruiser, was a glorious cocktail of impotent rage and dawning horror. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition derby of finances and reputations. The investors behind Pinnacle Living, who had backed Brenda's aggressive expansion, were horrified. Their insurance company took one look at the situation: the fraudulent survey, the lack of permits, the blatant construction within a documented flood easement, and denied their claim. They labeled it gross negligence. The homeowners in Lakeview Pinnacle Estates, who had paid a premium for lakefront property, were now faced with a swamp of half-submerged, rotting cabins, and the realization that their HOA president had led them into a legal and financial quagmire. The class action lawsuits began to fly. Not just against Brenda and the HOA, but against the developers, the construction company, and the now defunct surveyor. Brenda's little kingdom crumbled. She was voted out in a humiliating emergency meeting, her Escalade seen leaving the gated community for the last time a week later. The HOA itself went bankrupt, trying to settle the lawsuits. The developers cut their losses and sold the remaining land for pennies on the dollar to a conservation trust. But for me, the story wasn't over. I left the water at the 845-foot level for a full month. I wanted to make a point. I let the lake water do its work, soaking into every joint, warping every board, and filling the cabins with a permanent layer of silt and muck. When I was satisfied, I returned to the dam and, over another 12 hours, slowly lowered the water back to its normal recreational level of 838 feet. The scene that was revealed was one of utter devastation. The 139 cabins were a wreck. Mold had taken hold, windows were broken, and a foul stench hung in the air. The HOA and the developers declared bankruptcy and officially abandoned them. And so, I was left with 139 derelict structures on my land. I hired a salvage crew and a demolition team. We spent the better part of a year tearing them down, hauling away the debris, and remediating the land. It was a massive, expensive cleanup, but I paid for it by selling the scrap metal, prefabricated components, and by winning a significant court judgment against the developer's parent company for trespass and damages. Once the last cabin was gone, I brought in a landscape architect who specialized in ecosystem restoration. We replanted the entire 50-acre stretch with native trees, shrubs, and grasses. We restored the natural contours of the shoreline. Within 2 years, you couldn't even tell the cabins had ever been there. The oak trees are growing back, the birds have returned, and the quiet has settled back over Loch McLeod. Sometimes, new residents from the chastened, reorganized HOA will paddle by in a canoe and wave up at my lodge. They know the story, they know who owns the lake, and they know who controls the water. I never set out to be a villain or a hero. I just wanted to be left alone on the land my family had cared for a century. Brenda and her HOA saw my heritage as a commodity, and my patience as weakness. They learned that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and that nature, when properly directed, is the ultimate arbiter of justice. And that's how I fixed 139 HOA violations in one go. Thanks for listening to my story. I'll catch you on the next one.